For decades, the U.S. government banned a single word from ever being spoken in an official weather forecast. That word was tornado. Not because tornadoes weren't real. Because officials at the U.S. Weather Bureau were genuinely convinced that the word alone, printed in a public forecast, would trigger widespread panic, stampedes, chaos, even riots. So for years, meteorologists were instructed to avoid it entirely, even when they suspected severe rotating storms were forming. And on one single afternoon in 1925, that decision may have cost hundreds of American lives. This is the story of the deadliest tornado to ever touch American soil, a storm so massive, so fast, and so unprecedented that meteorologists still study it as a freak of nature, over a century later. March 18, 1925. A warm, unusually humid morning across the Midwest for mid-March. Farmers in Missouri are out working their fields ahead of spring planting season. Kids are sitting in one-room schoolhouses across small towns in Illinois and Indiana. Shopkeepers are opening for the day. It's an entirely ordinary Wednesday. Nobody has any idea what's forming in the sky above them. At 1:01 p.m., near the small town of Ellington, Missouri, a tornado touches down. But here's twist number one. This wasn't going to behave like any tornado anyone had ever recorded before. Most tornadoes last minutes, travel a few miles, then dissipate. This one stayed on the ground continuously for 3.5 hours. It traveled 219 miles, cutting a nearly unbroken path of destruction through 3 entire states, Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the distance from New York City to Washington, D.C., one single, continuous tornado, never lifting fully off the ground, covering that entire distance in one uninterrupted rampage. To this day, over a century and thousands of documented tornadoes later, it still holds the record for the longest continuous tornado track ever documented anywhere in world history. And here's the detail that still baffles meteorologists studying it today. It moved at an average forward speed of 62 miles per hour, with some estimates suggesting it hit peaks over 70 miles per hour at points along its path. Most tornadoes drift along at a walking to jogging pace of 10 to 20 miles per hour, giving people at least some window to see it coming and take shelter. This storm was moving nearly as fast as a car on the highway, giving almost nobody directly in its path any real chance to see it, process what was happening, and escape. Because here's the brutal truth about 1925 America, there was no such thing as a tornado warning. No sirens mounted on town buildings. No weather radar to track a storm's rotation from miles away. No emergency alert breaking into a radio broadcast, because most rural households didn't even own a radio yet. In fact, meteorologists at the time weren't even officially allowed to use the word tornado in forecasts, because the U.S. Weather Bureau believed the word itself would trigger dangerous public panic, a policy that had been quietly in place for decades before this storm ever formed. So as this massive, record-breaking storm tore across the Midwest at highway speed, most people in its path had no warning at all. No advance notice whatsoever that anything unusual was even forming that day. Many didn't even realize what was coming until they heard what survivors would later describe as a deep, overwhelming roar, like 1,000 freight trains bearing down at once, seconds before their homes were gone entirely. The town of Murfreesboro, Illinois took the hardest hit of the entire path. The tornado struck with almost no warning in the middle of the day, while children were still in school and workers were still at local factories and shops, flattening entire neighborhoods in a matter of seconds. 234 people died in Murfreesboro alone, making it, to this day, the deadliest single-city tornado disaster in the entire recorded history of the United States. But here's twist number 2, and it's the detail that makes this story almost impossible to fully comprehend. The tornado didn't just hit Murfreesboro and move on. It carved a continuous, unbroken path directly through multiple towns in immediate succession: Gorham, DeSoto, Parrish, West Frankfort, leveling entire communities one after another, sometimes with barely 10 or 15 minutes between each strike, giving rescue efforts in one town almost no time to even begin before news arrived that the very same storm had just destroyed the next town over. In DeSoto, Illinois, the tornado struck a local school building directly, during class hours. 33 children were killed in that single building alone, remaining, to this day, the deadliest tornado strike on a school in United States history. By the time the storm finally lifted off the ground in Indiana, nearly 3.5 hours after it first touched down in Missouri, it had killed 695 people across 3 states. It remains, to this day, the single deadliest tornado in American history, and it's not particularly close. The second deadliest tornado in U.S. history, which struck Georgia and South Carolina decades later, killed roughly half that number. Over 15,000 homes were destroyed along the storm's path. Entire towns that had existed peacefully that morning were simply gone by evening, reduced to splinters and scattered rubble, with survivors wandering through debris fields in the fading light, searching for family members among the wreckage. There were no ambulances rushing in from surrounding cities, no organized state emergency response teams, no National Guard mobilization in the way we'd expect today. Just neighbors helping neighbors, doctors from nearby towns driving in on damaged roads, and desperate families relying on word of mouth and whoever could reach one of the few working telephone lines still standing. Here's twist number 3, and it might be the most important part of this entire story. The disaster was so catastrophic, so far beyond anything the country had ever experienced from a single storm, that it forced a slow but permanent reckoning with how America handled severe weather. In the years and decades that followed, the very taboo that had banned meteorologists from even saying the word tornado in public forecasts slowly began to crumble under the weight of what had happened that day. Scientists and weather officials began pushing harder for real forecasting systems, warning networks, and public alert methods, the earliest seeds of the tornado watches, storm sirens, and radar tracking systems that Americans now rely on every single time severe weather threatens their communities. It would still take decades to fully build out. The first official U.S. tornado forecast wasn't issued until 1948, over 20 years after the tri-state tornado, and it took decades more after that for nationwide radar and siren networks to become standard. But historians and meteorologists studying this event widely agree on one thing. The tri-state tornado's staggering, unprecedented death toll is part of what finally made the reality of tornadoes impossible for the government to keep quietly avoiding in the name of preventing panic. Today, if a storm even remotely close to the tri-state tornado's strength were detected forming, Americans across multiple states would receive warnings on their phones, on television, through sirens, minutes or even hours before it arrived. Meteorologists would track its exact path in real time using Doppler radar. Schools would shelter students. Communities would evacuate. In 1925, none of that existed. People simply looked up, heard a roar they'd never heard before, and had seconds to react. 695 people never got that chance. Survivors who lived through it described the sky turning an unnatural greenish-black in the minutes before the storm hit, the air suddenly going dead calm, and then, almost without transition, the roar arriving alongside winds that stripped bark clean off standing trees. Entire farms that had been in families for generations were wiped from the map in under a minute. Some survivors reported being lifted off the ground entirely and carried hundreds of feet before landing, miraculously, in debris fields that somehow cushioned the fall enough to survive. Others weren't so fortunate. In the weeks that followed, the death toll continued to climb as rescue crews worked through the wreckage, discovering bodies buried under collapsed buildings that hadn't been fully accounted for in the initial chaos. Newspapers across the country ran front-page coverage for days, and for the first time, many Americans outside the Midwest began to grasp just how violent and unpredictable these storms could truly be. This is the soul of America, a nation that turned its worst weather tragedy in history into the warning systems that protect millions of lives today, Built from a silence that, for too long, cost people the one thing that might have saved them: the truth about what was coming.